Thank you, everybody, for scarfing down your pizza promptly and returning. Um, the next item in our program is our roundtable on the global impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're very excited to present a panel of expert scholars on Ukraine and the also impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war on different regions. So we are here representing perspectives from scholarship on Eastern Europe, as well as East Asia and the Middle East. And I'm going to quickly introduce our distinguished guests. First in alphabetical order is Daniel Brumberg, who is an associate professor and director of democracy and government studies, governance studies at Georgetown University. He is also the senior advisor to and co-founder of the Democracy and Governance MA program at Georgetown University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Washington, D.C. based Arab Center. Previously to that, he was a special advisor at the United States Institute of Peace. He is also a visiting professor of Kuwait/Gulf Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. Prior to coming to Georgetown University, he was a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at Emory University, a visiting fellow in the Middle East program in the Jimmy Carter Center, and a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Social Science Master's program. He tells me that he had an office not too far from where we are today. Dan earned his PhD at UChicago in 1991, has published seminal articles on dynamics of political, social, and economic change in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world. His work has appeared in leading print and online journals, including the Journal of Democracy, foreignpolicy.com, Responsible Statecraft, and theatlantic.com. His books include Reinventing Khomeini, The Struggle for Reform in Iran by University of Chicago Press, Identity and Reform in the Muslim World, Challenges for U.S. Engagement, co-edited with Dina Shehata, and most recently, Power and Political Change in Iran, co-edited with Farideh Farhi, and published by Indiana University Press. Brumberg has served as a consultant to the U.S. Department of State and the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, focusing on human rights, security sector reform, and governance issues in the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran. He has lived or conducted field research in France, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Israel, Kuwait, and Indonesia. And in addition to all this work on the Middle East, he has also taught courses on the problem of polarization in the United States and other countries, and is the co-creator of the In Your Shoes Project, a Georgetown University initiative that uses performance and theater techniques to encourage college students to reach across ideological, social, and identity divides. He speaks French, Arabic, and Hebrew, and lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Lori, and their two cats, Jasper and Bisu.
Yeah, you got the whole thing.
I know, yeah. You got a lot of titles. Most importantly, their son, Gabriel, is a freshman this year at UChicago. I'm going to move on next in the order is Eugene Rakel, who is here on our Zoom screen. Eugene Rakel is a associate professor, Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago, and he's also the director of the University of Chicago East European and Russian Eurasian Center for Eastern European and Russian Eurasian Studies. He is a cultural and medical anthropologist with interests encompassing the anthropology of science, biomedicine and psychiatry, addiction and its treatment, suggestion and healing, and post-socialist transformations in Eurasia. He's particularly concerned with the circulation of new forms of knowledge and clinical intervention produced by biomedicine, neuroscience, and psychiatry. His work follows therapeutic technologies as they move from bench to bedside and from one cultural to institutional setting to another, examining how they intersect with the lives of practitioners and patients. His book, Governing Habits, Treating Alcoholism in the Post-Soviet Clinic, was published by Cornell University Press in the fall of 2016. And I am going to move on to Suzanne Wengel. Suzanne is the N.R. Drove, am I pronouncing that right? Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Her research examines Eurasian agriculture and food systems and other aspects of the post-Soviet transformation, including the creation of energy markets, the effects of sanctions, welfare reforms, and the politics of expertise. Her recent book, Black Earth, White Bread, is an interdisciplinary history of the Soviet and Russian agriculture and food systems that documents interactions between political projects, technological improvements, and quotidian practices. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Wishnick, also on our Zoom screen here. Elizabeth Wishnick is a senior research scientist in the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division at the Center for Naval Analyses, on leave from her position as professor of political science at Montclair State University. Dr. Wishnick is also a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University and an affiliate researcher at the Center for Arctic Resilience in the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Dr. Wishnick has dual regional expertise on China and Russia, and is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Sino-Russian relations, Asian security, including Taiwan and Russia, and Arctic geopolitics. Her book project, China's Risk, Oil, Water, Food, and Regional Security, forthcoming from Columbia University Press, addresses security consequences of energy, water, and food risks in China for its Eurasian neighbors, a topic she explores in a related policy blog, chinaresourcerisks.com. That link is available on our website. She received a PhD in political science from Columbia University, an MA in Russian and East European studies from Yale University, and a BA from Barnard College. Sorry. I've read this far, I gotta get to the end. She speaks Chinese, Russian, and French, and recently spent 6 months in Vladivostok, Russia, Shanghai, China, and Almaty, Kazakhstan as part of a Fulbright Global Scholar Award. Please welcome our distinguished panelists. And I'm gonna pass it to Eugene to begin the panel. Eugene, take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all. I'm quarantining home with COVID, unfortunately. I'm going to be moderating our panel today, and the format is that each of our panelists will give a brief introduction. We will have a few, hopefully, questions among the panelists, and then we will try to open it up as soon as possible to questions from the audience. So why don't we just move in alphabetical order, and Daniel Brumberg can start us off.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks for hosting me. My wife was supposed to attend as well, but she got COVID and things changed up a little bit. But I just want to thank everybody and Krishna in particular for the warm welcome and putting me up here. And as it was already said, this is the secondary reason for me being in Chicago, and that is our son just started here this year, and so it is a bit of a tradition. I met my wife here. I was a student in the political science department for too long, classic U Chicago phenomenon. And I also taught here my last year in the social science program with Suzanne Rudolph, the late great Suzanne Rudolph. And I also worked with Marvin Zonas. Some of you may have known who Marvin was very closely, almost a surrogate father. This is a particularly important subject to me from a personal perspective. My father escaped Warsaw on the day of the Nazi invasion with his parents, and were nearly killed, and went to Lithuania and lived in Lithuania for 6 months under Soviet occupation. The Soviets were busy trying to arrest my grandfather, who they certainly would have shot in a nanosecond had they caught him. But they made it to Japan as a result of getting a visa from a Japanese diplomat named Sugihara, who you may have heard of, and came to the United States. And my father made a career as a Sovietologist. His name was Abraham Brumberg, and he edited a journal called Problems of Communism. I imagine some of our colleagues have encountered him or his work at some point. So I grew up in a Sovietological world, and that was part of the world I knew when I was a student here. But I went towards the Middle East arena over time. So this is an opportunity to speak a little bit about how these two arenas, the Ukraine, Eastern European arena, and the Middle East arena intersect, and do so in ways that are unfortunately not terribly encouraging and increasingly problematic. There's no silver lining here. in terms of what I'm going to talk about. And it's a very complex subject. So I'm going to just enumerate a few key ideas.
We see you. Give us
because I
one
think
second.
Sorry? I'm okay. I'm going to enumerate a few key ideas because I think that the idea here is to have a conversation. First of all, very briefly, because we're all teachers, and I come from a family of teachers. My twin sister is a teacher, just retired from the public education system in Providence, and her husband's a teacher at Wheaton College. My late mother was a teacher. I grew up in a teacher world, which I really I think I understand in many ways and really appreciate. But I do want to say a couple quick things in terms of teaching this subject. And one is that I think it's important to recognize that we as much as possible, particularly in the older grades in the high school arena, we make it clear to our students that when we're trying to sort of ferret out the political significance of the intersection of the Middle East with Eastern Europe, whatever the international arena is, that we make it clear that the point of view, the analytical framework that we use really influences the kinds of questions we ask and the answers we come up with. Now, this sounds slightly postmodern perhaps to you, but I do think that there's a vigorous debate about the implications of the Ukraine war. And if you follow the work of John Mearsheimer, you'll know that John's hyper-rationalist perspective has led him to conclusions which are very different from those of other scholars. So I do think we need to sort of make that clear as much as we can to our students. The three paradigms that really seem to be influencing the way we understand these interactions. One is a kind of neoconservative global authoritarian paradigm, which suggests that there's a global war between democracy and autocracy, and this is how to best understand these dynamics. There is a geostrategic rationalist perspective focusing on state and security, and there is a kind of foreign policy perspective. These are the sort of three paradigms that are out there. I have to say, from my perspective, while I don't agree with much of the conclusions that John Mearsheimer has drawn, that I think a geostrategic, a state-oriented approach is the most useful way to understand how and what ways the Middle East interacts with the Ukraine situation. But more importantly, I do think we have to give our students some sort of awareness that those sort of perspectives offer very different conclusions. That's the first point. The second point I'd like to make here is that in the context of a globalized world in which there's no longer a single superpower, and we have a multipolar world, the nature of that geostrategic world has really transformed the capacity of the United States to influence events, especially in the Middle East. And in that regard, the United States is no longer really quite the power it used to be. And Russia is, in some sense, the pivotal part of the story, because Russia, apart from having very clear interests in Syria, the Syrian regime would not exist had it not been for what the Kremlin did to rescue Assad. Russia has relations with all the Middle East actors, and the United States doesn't. And that is a crucial point. It provides Russia with the kind of leverage that the United States does not have. A part of the story that we've been dealing with here is the reticence of Israel to support the Ukraine, despite the fact that it's a Jewish state, despite the fact that there are 130,000 Jews in Ukraine, despite the fact that there are 1 million Jews in Russia. From a strategic point of view, Israel has many concerns about what would happen in its backyard or its semi-backyard, i.e. Syria, if it supported the Ukraine. So Russia has this extraordinary sort of leverage. And Russia figured out a series of relationships prior to the Ukraine war with Iran, Turkey, and Israel that really set the boundaries of the readiness of any of those players to exercise influence in ways that might rub, let's say, the Russians the wrong way. So Iran, Turkey, and Israel, those are the three key players in this story, I think, in terms of the Middle East and how it was organized and how Russia really set understandings with all those players. Turkey in terms of its involvement in Syria, Iran in terms of how much it could expand its influence in Syria, and Israel to the extent to which Israel could use its armed forces against Iran without jeopardizing Russia's interests. So that was a very complex set of factors that one has to understand, and that all existed before the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war steps into this picture by really altering all the calculations of the key players. And the fundamental part of this story that I think we have to recognize is not only that, excuse me, not only that none of the players really would, I think all the players, including China, by the way, were quite surprised by what Russia did in terms of intervening and invading Ukraine. But when it did that, that was followed, of course, by the expanding relationship between Russia and Iran. And Iran's alliance with the Ukraine and Russia has really turned the tables on all those relationships I mentioned. And we can talk more about it. I'm not going to I have all kinds of notes here, which unfortunately are my handwriting, so I can't read any of them. But that relationship, well, Iran has provided perhaps 3,000 drones to the Russians, deadly drones, and a lot of the worst damage to civilians as a result of Russian drones. But that expanding footprint of Russia, of Iran in terms of Ukraine has really altered the perspectives of all the players. And how much time do I have? I mean, I just want to make sure it's a couple more minutes. Is that basically it? I just want to get a sense of, I got a couple of minutes. So here's the lay of the land. There was an accommodation between Iran and between Russia and Israel about how much force Israel could use in Syria. There was a similar accommodation with Turkey and a similar accommodation with Iran. Now that Iran and Russia are really locked in an expanding alliance in Ukraine, the Israelis are in a real tight bond because they feel, on the one hand, that if they support the Ukraine government militarily, the Russians will make them pay a very high price in Syria, and they're probably correct. At the same time, the Israelis are very well aware that Iran's expanding influence in Ukraine has real repercussions for Israel and its security. So that's a dilemma. And thus far, the Israelis don't know how to solve it because they really don't want to rub the Russians the wrong way, but they see Iran's missiles and its drones going into Ukraine, and it has geostrategic implications for the security of the Middle East. The Iranians are expanding their footprint in Syria because they now see Russia occupied in Ukraine, and they feel they can push the boundaries of what was permissible to Russia beforehand. So in Southwest Syria, they're expanding their influence. The Turks, well, the Turkish government might invade the Northeast with the goal of basically destroying the Kurdish forces there. The United States would be very unhappy, but Russia and the government in Damascus wouldn't be unhappy. So the short end of the story of this, the summary conclusion is that basically the blowback from the Ukraine war is going to probably make the Middle East, and particularly the Iran, Russia, Lebanon, Israel arena much more unstable because none of the countries feel constrained now. And we saw that when Israel attacked Iranian Hezbollah weapons factory outside Damascus a week and a half ago. This is something that the Russians wouldn't have permitted not long ago, but they're busy in Ukraine. So the possibility, and in the context of no agreement between the United States and Iran on the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, and there's escalating possibility of military confrontation between Iran and the United States. All this means that the Ukraine war, apart from its obvious geostrategic and humanitarian implications, are going to sort of feed a period of uncertainty and escalating violence in the region that could make things worse than they already are. So I'm sorry to end on such a bleak note, but I think those are the realities. Thank you.
Great. And I think we'll have time to come back for you to expand on some of those points.
Sure.
Suzanne Wengel, go ahead and present your.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks to Series for the invitation. Thanks to Esther and Krishna for organizing, and thanks to you guys all for coming. And also, I want to just start with saying the kids who are in my classroom are actually the product of your classrooms. So I really appreciate all the teaching you do. And you know, it's an uphill battle, as you know, because there's so much information out there. And so we're sort of all in this together to make American kids into global citizens. So just as a preface, as Krishna mentioned, I study post-Soviet economies, and I'm interested in the sort of social political processes that happen after these economies transition from the planned economy to market economy. So I'm thinking about various markets. I was thinking about energy markets for a good part of my career. And for the last few years, I've been thinking about agriculture and food systems and global trade in agricultural commodities. So I'm currently working on a project that looks more closely at the role of Eurasian grain in particular. So I'm going to just have used this opportunity to talk a little bit about grain, right? And, you know, we're very used to worry about oil and gas in this region, right? Energy is a big concern. But I think in the US, you know, people aren't really used to worrying about where food is coming from, right? Is there sort of enough grain, because the U.S. is a huge agricultural powerhouse, right? It's obviously self-sufficient and exports a lot of grain. So the general public hasn't really had to worry about where does grain come from, but this is actually a luxury that many other countries do not have. There's a lot of populous countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East that are dependent on food imports and grain imports in particular. And so governments in these countries, actually includes China, governments have been sort of worried about where does grain come from, and they're following global trade closely. They follow global food commodity prices and so on. So in particular, those countries are China, Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh. Those are countries that are huge importers of Eurasian grain. Turkish TV was the first TV that called me right after the invasion, and they were sort of, so what's going to happen with Ukrainian grain? That happened and sort of within an hour of the invasion. It was Turkish TV. It was not, you know, NBC and ABC were sort of like coming around to that realization way later. So Eurasian grain is mostly grown in Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. In what is called the Black Earth Belt. So the Black Earth Belt, also known as Chernozem, is one of the world's most fertile grain growing regions. It accounts for about a third of globally traded wheat. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat, accounting for about 20% of global trade. Ukraine accounts for about 5 to 8% of grain, and Kazakhstan for a further 2 to 3% of grain. And that's grain overall. Wheat and corn, they account for even larger numbers. So I'll just talk a little bit about you know, history, and since this is about the role of the conflict and the global impact, I'll talk about how disruptions to Ukrainian agriculture have shaped these global grain markets. So I can't help not bringing a little bit of history to the talk, because there's always history there, as the history teachers among you, I'm sure, know. So Eurasia was actually a really important breadbasket for Europe in the 19th century. The US and the Russian Empire were competing to feed the industrial workforce in the 19th century in European cities, right? So Manchester, Rotterdam, Paris were importing a lot of grain because the people were working in factories instead of on farms. And the Russian Empire was a big grain exporter. So after 1917, however, after the Russian Revolution, Russian wheat exports declined sharply. And that has a number of reasons, including, you know, revolution, civil war, collectivization. A lot of domestic turmoil meant that Russia wasn't actually producing all that much grain anymore. And this is actually was true for most of the 20th century. And in fact, you may notice since the 1970s, Russia was, the Soviet Union was an importer of American grain. Interesting fact of history. You know, Brezhnev agreed to import grain because he wanted Soviet citizens to eat more meat, but to eat more meat, he had to feed the cows and other livestock, and American farmers were just much more efficient in producing feed grains. So Ukraine is by has an incredibly fertile climate for agriculture, has incredibly rich soils. It also has a very mild and long growing season because it's located more southern than Russia. And it has ample rainfall. So it's sort of a combination of sort of magic factors that make it really, really fertile. So it's very good for growing wheat, but it's even better for growing corn. So the Soviet history of corn growing is really interesting. I will not go into that because that would be a tangent too far. But I'm sure you know this. Corn is in incredibly high demand globally. So Ukraine has shifted to producing more corn. And Ukraine has actually become one of the world's leading corn producers and exporters. So because Ukraine has seen a huge corn boom in the last 10 to 15 years, it increased between, I think, 2000, sorry, I'm not remembering my statistics, but I think it's over the last 10 years, Ukraine increased production tenfold. It doubled yields and exports went from 0.05% of global trade to 14% of global trade. So Ukraine exports 14% of global corn. That is a lot of corn for sort of a relatively small country. And not surprisingly, agriculture has become a really important part of the Ukrainian economy, and also an important part of its export. It's the biggest export sector, and it earns important foreign currency, right, that Ukraine can then use to buy other stuff. A further important bit of information is that all Ukrainian grain, or virtually all, 98%, in addition to all Russian grain and all, actually not all Kazakh grain, but most of the region's grain is exported via the Black Sea. Kazakhstan actually supplies some of its regional neighbors, such as Afghanistan and other Central Asian countries, but Ukraine and Russia export most grain via the Black Sea. This will be important in a minute when I talk about the Black Sea blockade. So let me talk about, so this is all the picture up to 2021. 2021 was an incredibly successful year for Ukrainian agriculture. And then the war started, right? So we all know that the war has been grievous and extremely damaging in many ways. It's well known that Russia has targeted energy infrastructure, civilian targets, in addition to military targets. Sadly, the war has also been really harmful and detrimental to Ukrainian agriculture. So together with a Ukrainian collaborator, Vitaly Dankovich, who is actually an agricultural economist and also a farmer and also a dad. And, given all these responsibilities, he's just been really a wonderful collaborator. And a lot of the sources I have through him, right? We do a lot of interviews and he sort of translates Ukrainian media sources and, channels the important information for me, and I do some of the writing. So the conclusions we're drawing is that the damage to Ukrainian agriculture is actually quite targeted, right? It's not just sort of this collateral accidental damage that also affects farm. And we draw this conclusion basically because we catalog what is happening to farms. And there's sort of 4 types of damage. One is theft, right? So the Russian troops actually were stealing machinery, grain, all kinds of expensive assets. There's also very significant disruptions of the growing cycle. There's sort of fires later of harvests, and there was mines and fields and so on that have made it really hard to plant and harvest. The third type of damage is the damage to infrastructure. And I should have mentioned that before I started with my types. All of these damages have different long and short-term costs. So the damage to infrastructure will take many years to repair. So that includes bombings of grain elevators, transport infrastructure, grain terminals and ports, and so on. In this category is actually also the destruction of livestock that couldn't be fed due to the war. So the fourth type of damage is inflicted by Russia's naval blockade of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And because naval, should I wrap up? I'm good. Okay, because as I mentioned, Ukraine exports most of its grain via the Black Sea. This naval blockade has been really harmful. And this loss type has sort of currently created the most sort of overall damage to Ukrainian farm. So for the first 6 months of the war, all of Ukraine's ports were actually closed. Some of them were occupied by Russian troops. Mariupol, Berdyansk, Skadovsk, and Kherson were inaccessible, and then other parts were just closed because there couldn't be the ship cargo weren't able to land and take off. And so basically what happened is literally that grain piled up in Ukraine. So in the spring, Ukraine couldn't export, couldn't honor the contracts that they had made for the 2021 harvest. And then as sort of, as they harvested spring wheat, Ukraine has a winter wheat and a spring wheat season, and corn is harvested in the fall. But basically they just they didn't know what to do with the grain. It was basically piling up, and they were sort of, all the storage facilities were full, and it was getting more expensive to store. And so it was really a horrible situation. So what happened is then the prices for grain in Ukraine plummeted, right? Because there was basically a glut. There were, traders didn't want to buy. There were limited domestic users of grain, whereas farmers had a ton of grain on their hands, right? But what happened internationally was the opposite, right? So global food commodity prices had already been high before the war because of COVID-related stuff. And then all this grain from Ukraine didn't reach global markets, right? So food commodity prices were quite high, and there's a lot of concern about the damage this would do to the poor countries that relied on Eurasian grain. And so for the first 6 months, global food commodity prices were actually rising. An important turning point was what's called the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that you might know better as the Grain Corridor. So Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN came to an agreement on a partial easing of the naval blockade. So basically, Russia allowed a bunch of Ukrainian ships to export grain, and the agreement was reached in Istanbul, with Turkey brokering the agreement on July 22nd. And what happened immediately after is that global grain prices tapered off, right? There was sort of a sigh of relief. Importantly, this agreement that was reached in July was only valid for 120 days, which gets you to early November. So what Russia does on October 31, I remember this because it was on Halloween, and because we had prepared a press thing for for November 22, but Russia pulled out a couple weeks early, and we weren't prepared. But anyways, it wasn't Halloween. Russia pulled out of the agreement and threatened to not renew the agreement. And immediately the Chicago Board of Trade food commodity futures went up, and sort of global markets were really scared what would happen. Russia was able sort of to get assurances. So Russia has been using the grain corridor to extract concessions in the sanctions regime from the West, right? And so a sort of intense period of diplomacy followed, and then the agreement was renewed again. So the grain corridor was reestablished. Again, however, only for another 120 days. It's actually going to run out again on February 18. So we'll see what happens. So the grain initiative is sort of is a useful agreement, but it's very tenuous. It's very limited. Global food commodity prices taper off as long as there is an agreement, and Ukraine is able to export grain and earn foreign currency in return. So I'll finish here. Let me just see what my conclusions are, right? So conclusions are Eurasian grain is really important for many countries across the world that rely on wheat as a basic staple and on corn as livestock feed. High global commodity prices are really a political problem for a lot of these countries, because a lot of these countries, like Egypt, for example, subsidize grain, right? So if global commodity prices are high, it's really expensive for these governments to keep subsidizing. And then if they don't subsidize, that's politically challenging, because a lot of people rely on bread. And so Russia has been sort of using these global grain ties as leverage. And as long as Russia is actually holding Ukrainian grain hostage, it is likely going to be able to use this grain leverage in future negotiations. As this, if this is basically our media thing was going to be about don't renew this just for another 120 days. It's way too unstable. So we'll see what happens. February 18 is pretty much just around the corner. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne. And our last panelist is Elizabeth Wishnick.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the University of Chicago for inviting me to speak to you. I'm going to try to talk both about geopolitics and about grain. So try to make some points that related to the previous two presentations. And it's a pleasure to talk to all of you teachers virtually. It's a complicated situation in Ukraine, and I applaud your efforts to become informed about it and to teach your students about it. First, a little bit about terminology. What do we call this conflict? So personally, I'm going to talk about Russia's war on Ukraine, because if we call it the Russia-Ukraine war, as in the title, it implies to me at least some kind of equivalence that somehow both want to wage war. And from my perspective, Ukraine is defending its territory. Russia attacked Ukraine without any justification. And so the way we describe the conflict, I think, has some impact on how we understand it. And this is important in the context of the propaganda that Russia is putting out about its activities in Ukraine, and which is echoed by China and some other countries. And even in this country, some news outlets echo that Russian propaganda. So getting the facts straight is a challenge, given all the smoke and mirrors about the subject. So my area of focus is on Russia-China relations and China's position on the war and what the war means for East Asia. So the latter was what I was asked to talk about, so I'm going to focus mostly on that. So if we look at the impact of the Russian war on Ukraine on East Asia, in a nutshell, there are some opportunities for a few countries, namely China and India, in terms of getting some bargain basement deals on energy, but largely it's a destabilizing impact on the region. So when we think about this topic, what comes to mind immediately is Taiwan, because a lot of the news media focuses on that. What is China learning from Russia's war in Ukraine for its own intentions to potentially invade Taiwan? So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of speculation, but all of this is really high on speculation and low on information and facts, because the bottom line is that we don't really know what China is learning yet. I follow what Chinese experts say on this topic, and the authoritative sources really say very little at this point. And a lot is going to depend on how the conflict ends, what China is going to learn. So I'm going to set that topic aside. We can come back to it in the discussion if you're interested, and talk about areas where we have more concrete information about the impact. So sanctions. Does China help Russia evade sanctions that were imposed by the US, European countries, and some Asian countries? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that trade between China and Russia has increased by 30% in the last year to almost $200 billion. Some of that trade includes semiconductors, which Russia needs for technologies, but Chinese made semiconductors are not the highest quality. China continues to buy oil and gas from Russia, as does India, actually. So China has increased its energy purchases by about 40% from Russia. And so it helps Russia maintain its export revenues, and these revenues are important for the Russian economy. India previously was not a purchaser of Russian oil, and now 22% of its imports of oil, 1% of its imported oil was from Russia prior to the Russian war, and now 22%. So huge increase from India. So that's the way in which these some countries in Asia have helped Russia to circumvent sanctions. But there's no evidence that China is selling military equipment to Russia. They have a strategic partnership. They have areas of military cooperation, but very few companies have faced counter sanctions. Chinese companies have faced counter sanctions from the US for violating the imposed sanctions. But the trade that China and Russia engage in is important. And they also have currency swaps. So instead, because Russia has difficulties with the international banking system, they have exchanged rubles for Chinese yuan, which enables Russia to buy Chinese goods using Chinese currency instead of using a hard currency, which is in short supply in Russia. So those are the ways in which China in particular has helped. India, despite being involved in security arrangements with the United States through the Quad mechanism, is an important partner for Russia. They have longstanding military cooperation in terms of military production. And India has encouraged a peaceful solution to the conflict, but has not applied any pressure in terms of sanctions to do so. And India is interested in keeping its connection to Russia because its main opponent is China, which is another partner of Russia. And it's much like the situation with Israel that we heard about earlier. If India, it would alienate Russia, it might support China more fully in terms of the conflict between China and India. And so India doesn't do that. China provides rhetorical support for Russia in the UN Security Council. It echoes Russian propaganda about the war and so on. And it claims to be impartial, although most countries see China as siding with Russia in terms of this conflict. So what are the destabilizing impacts on East Asia? So what I described here is how China and India have benefited to some degree from keeping trade, especially in the energy sector, alive with Russia. I would say that on East Asia, we have a destabilizing impact because you have more of a polarization. You have the US and its allies, and you have Russia and China, which cooperate in terms of military exercises in the regions, joint patrols near Japan, and so on. And you also might see more of an arms race developing in Northeast Asia. One of the side effects of Putin's nuclear threats against the West to try to dissuade them from entering or for supporting Ukraine more robustly has been the impact on North Korea. So is North Korea going to be emboldened to use nuclear threats to achieve its goals? We had the South Korean government recently say they would be amenable to having US nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea, again, and South Korea might develop its own nuclear weapon. So that's a very would be a very destabilizing development. And Japan also is boosting its military capabilities in recent, in the recent period, partly because of concerns about China and Taiwan, but a whole regional dynamic could be unleashed if North Korea and South Korea begin an arms race. Now, turning to Southeast Asia, here's where the grain issue comes in, because Southeast Asian countries are big importers of Eurasian grains. So ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they're major wheat importers. They account for 15% of global wheat imports. And Indonesia, an enormous country, is one of the top importers. It was the second largest market for Ukrainian wheat, for example. So even though this region is very far from Ukraine, it's been suffering from high energy prices, high food prices, and that's why we saw the president of Indonesia try to encourage the leaders of Russia and Ukraine to resolve their differences peacefully. And so what about Taiwan? Just to say a word about Taiwan, since I started off that way. So even though we don't know what China is thinking about Taiwan in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what has happened is that there's a lot more focus on Taiwan in the United States, in Europe, and we see a lot more diplomacy going on between the US and Taiwan, between various European leaders and Taiwan. And there's a sense that we can't be caught flat-footed in the event of a potential Chinese invasion, that we have to be better prepared in advance, because Ukraine can be supplied through land corridors, but Taiwan is an island, and so you would have to pre-position a lot of equipment around very much in advance. And so just recently we had an agreement between the US and the Philippines to have additional areas where the US and the Philippines could cooperate in terms of military preparations for such an eventuality. And so I'm just going to conclude here. I think East Asia is quite distant from Ukraine, but the conflict has had an impact in terms of the region's geopolitics and also the region's access to resources, energy, and also grains. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think we have a general picture of a lot of global destabilization caused by the war coming up as a theme in all three of the presenters. I have a few questions I can get to perhaps later, but since we're at 1:20, I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So why don't we just go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience? Do we have
I have a microphone, so the Zoom audience will also be able to hear you. So
oh, wonderful.
If there's any questions from the audience. Oh, here we go.
I'm just curious more about Syria, how it's fitting into this. It was such a big news story and it's almost like we've forgotten about it. So how does this fit into the puzzle?
Should I go on that? Well, that's it's a great question. And for both Turkey and Israel, the fundamental question is what's going to happen not only to the future of Syria, but whether Syria's relationship with Iran and Hezbollah and Lebanon will be strengthened. Hezbollah has the ability to launch missiles against Israel that would effectively destroy much of the country if it chose to do so. And even with the anti-ballistic missile systems that Israel has, if Hezbollah chose to rain down those missiles, enough would get through to cause a lot of damage, and the Israelis know that. So rather than confronting Hezbollah directly, they are trying to confront Iran in Syria and send a message to Hezbollah and deter Hezbollah in that particular way. And that involves dealing with the Russians. So there's been an understanding between Russia and Israel about the use of force. And there's a kind of understanding, there's a hotline, and if Israel was going to go in there and attack Hezbollah Iranian forces, they would avoid Russian forces, and they might even signal Russia ahead of time of what was coming. And that was already coming apart before the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now it is even more so. In fact, in May of 22, Russia fired missiles at Israeli planes. So so when it comes to sort of Israel's approach to sort of dealing with Iran in Syria, it is definitely the case that it can't depend on its relationship with Russia anymore to sort of contain that situation. On the other hand, it's not willing to go against Russia in Ukraine. And the Iranians feel that with Russia busy bringing their mercenaries from Syria to the Ukraine to fight the war, right? That they have a lot more room to play now. And so they feel unconstrained. The Israelis feel unconstrained. So the possibility that Syria becomes a live battlefield in ways that were perhaps suggested by Israel's attack against Iranian factories outside of Damascus 2 weeks ago really would suggest that could happen.
With the grain being such an issue in the world, question arises, what about the United Nations sending in an international force just to export the grain out, like bringing in, carrier groups from 3 or 4 different countries, and the United Nations saying, look, we just need to get the food out to the rest of the world. People are starving.
Yeah, great question. So the UN's World Food Program has been trying to do that precisely. So that's actually why the UN is part of the agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey. And so this is happening, but it's still sort of contingent on Russia's approval, because it's basically the Russian Navy that sits there and can block any ship, whether a UN ship or commercial vessels. And actually, a lot of commercial vessels have stopped going to the Black Sea because they can't get insurance, actually, because of sanctions. It's just too risky. So actually, there is a lot of UN involvement. But I'm actually to sort of follow up on that question. I'll have a question to Dan about Turkey, because if you know the geography of the Black Sea, the ships have to go through the Bosporus, and Turkey has control over all ships going in and out. And actually, all of just to go back to Liz's point about energy, a lot of the Russian oil actually also leaves through the Bosphorus, right? So Russia is both dependent on Turkey, but Turkey is also dependent on Russian and Ukrainian grain. So there's a lot of mutual dependency, and I think the UN can be a broker, but they can't actually get countries to do what they don't want to do. That's sort of like a long answer to your question.
Dan, did you want to respond to the question?
Did I not respond?
No. It sounded like you were posing a question also to.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I guess maybe we should. Dan can hold the question.
Yeah,
because there's
so
more
we
audience
can talk
questions.
more about it.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
go on.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We can have a little.
I was just going to ask what Kazakhstan has to either gain or lose in all of this.
Gosh, I think Liz should answer that question. I'll pass the answer to Liz.
Thank you. 'Cause I just spent a month in Kazakhstan, actually, in October, and it was fascinating because that was the time when you had hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing there to avoid the draft. And so the government of Kazakhstan said that people should welcome the Russians, and they refused to send them back unless they were, under some certain exceptional circumstances. But the government of Kazakhstan also refused to recognize the Russian so-called annexations of Ukrainian territory. So Kazakhstan is trying to avoid antagonizing Russia, having a very long border with Russia also, but also trying to avoid being the next target on the list that Vladimir Putin has on his desk of former imperial lands that he would like to reconquer. So it's a difficult spot. It's an anxiety-producing situation, and it came at a bad time for Kazakhstan because the Chinese border was closed for a long time due to COVID, and so Kazakhstan was having trouble, with its trade to China, and then now Russia is relying on Kazakhstan as well as on other countries, Georgia, Turkey, as a conduit for trade, to keep the Russian economy going. So Kazakhstan is in a kind of anxious spot, and would like, I think, both to engage more with other Central Asian countries and with other countries than Russia and China, to try to diversify its foreign policy. But I would just add to what Suzanne said about energy. The energy exports I was talking about to Asia don't come from the Bosphorus. They come from Siberia. So they come from the Asian part of Russia. So they would not be affected by what's going on in the Bosphorus.
If I can just add a quick note here, and because it'll fill in and also respond to something you said, and that is, I mean, the fundamental point here is that Turkey now is Erdogan is trying to repair his relations with a lot of countries. Interestingly, Israel has been a major focus. Dubai has been another focus, but Russia and the rapprochement between Russia and Turkey is the key story here, because Turkey opposed Assad and wanted to bring him down, and therefore it made the Iranians and Russians very unhappy. And now they've basically given up on that, and they're actually look like they might reestablish relations with Assad in Damascus. So that really changes the name of the game. So what is Turkey's basic interest? To destroy the Kurdish movement. And that, of course, affects the U.S. position because we have close alliances. Not that we haven't walked away from the Kurdish movement when it was in our strategic interests, but nevertheless, that poses real problems. And Russia has bought and purchased advanced anti-aircraft missile systems from, Turkey has purchased advanced anti-missile systems from Russia. So that relationship there is just indicative of the fact that as much as the United States is trying to exercise influence in the Middle East, Russia and China, but particularly Russia, is well, in many respects, well ahead of the U.S.
How does the relationship between Russia and Turkey impact Turkey's decision to allow Sweden to be joining NATO? Do you feel that's a factor, or is it other factors than the Russian-Turkish relation?
Could you repeat that question one more time?
Well, right now, Turkey is holding out on Sweden being introduced into NATO or joining NATO. And I'm just questioning, like, how much of that is the Russian-Turkish relationship, or, how much impact is that in Turkey trying to maintain relationship with Russia?
I don't know. I don't have enough information to answer that question. Obviously, it must be a major consideration for Turkey. But its relations well before that with the United States were declining. And Turkey was resisting the American efforts to get them to shut down the missile agreement with Russia. Turkey is a member of NATO, of course. And yet, in many respects, it's behaved very differently than all the other members of NATO. So I think that my speculation would be that Turkey is trying to prove a point with Sweden and Finland, and may wreck the ability, because they have a veto power, as you would suggest, over that decision. So, Erdogan's got an election coming up in June, and the opposition remains split, but you never know, that could be maybe temporarily overcome. So Erdogan is very adept at using regional and global foreign policy to reinforce his regime. And I think that's what's going on.
Thank you. So we're at what, 90 seconds to midnight right now is where they updated the atomic disaster clock. And I understand that Ukraine, obviously, this should be sort of their choice, whether they continue with this war or not, but there's obviously external factors. It is having such a huge impact on everything in the world. We're looking at I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that Putin is a huge narcissist. Would he push the button? I mean, we all say horrible things about him. So, I mean, what makes us think he wouldn't? And then, of course, there's the possibility of escalation between us and China and Taiwan. At what point, well, what's the way out, I guess? Is there a way out of this? Because this is such a bloody mess.
Very simple question for all of you. What's the way out of this?
Yeah, I feel like if we had an answer, we wouldn't be sitting here. Yeah, it's the $1 million question, right? I think as much as everyone can sort of speculate about what is going on in the inner circle of the Putin leadership, and there's a lot of struggles between Putin and his inner circle and then the military, right? But we just don't really know that much, right? I've studied Russia for 2 decades. I can't even remember. And we have very limited knowledge, and so I think we don't know what could make Russia stop. So I actually tend to think, you said, Ukraine could stop. I think we also need to mostly think about since Russia is the aggressor, what could make Russia stop? But I think, one way of thinking about this, to me, a likely situation is some kind of frozen conflict, right? The conflict will not be resolved, but there might be, right now the conflict is still ramping up. There's more troops pouring in. There's more violence. Other conflicts in this region have sort of reached stalemates in what are called frozen conflicts, right? So there's sort of a temporary, very contingent, very tenuous agreement. Okay, we're gonna just keep our lines here, and Dan and Liz can weigh in what that would entail. I think it would entail some kind of agreement on territorial temporary boundaries. It would entail these agreements about the Black Sea and exports. It would entail agreements about how they would relate to Iran and Turkey and NATO and Western allies. So I think there's a lot of sort of steps and agreements that have to be reached even for this sort of suboptimal frozen conflict. I think but that is a sort of more realistic scenario than sort of like, what does it take to reach peace? I mean, that's my take. I don't know what I do want my colleagues to weigh in here, though.
I want Liz to weigh in. Then I feel safe to say that.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, I think that what happens in Taiwan has nothing to do with what happens in Ukraine. China has wanted to, they claim that Taiwan is a part of their territory. They wanted to so-called reunify it since 1949. So what they'll do that when they'll try to do that when they feel they could successfully achieve their goal. And it has not, I don't think what Russia is doing has any impact on that. But in terms of the situation on the ground in Ukraine. We had previously, or what we thought was a frozen conflict after 2014 in Ukraine, and it did not prove to be a stable outcome. It kind of emboldened, I think, Putin to believe that he could easily finish the job, because he managed to take over Crimea in a few days and was expecting a similar outcome this time. So I think he uses the threat of nuclear use to try to dissuade other countries from helping Ukraine and to increase the costs of military aid. But I don't think he's likely to follow through in any major way. I mean, I think a realistic concern is some kind of tactical nuclear weapon use on the battlefield, which could lead to some kind of escalation. But I don't see a very good scenario, because unless Russia is defeated on the battlefield in some significant way, I think that these so-called frozen conflicts are going to become hot conflicts. And some Russian officials have made very alarming claims about Kazakhstan, for example, that Kazakhstan is also a fake country, and Russia should look next at Kazakhstan. So there's a lot of concern that if Russia isn't more forcefully stopped in this area, then it creates a lot more insecurity in the future. But I don't know how this is, it's going to play out on the battlefield. We're in a pause situation, and a new offensive is going to happen, and I don't think we're going to have peace, at least unless Russia will be expelled from the territories it took after February 24th and go back to the status quo ante. I don't think anything less would be acceptable. And many countries that are supporting Ukraine want a more conclusive victory for stability in Europe.
I'll just add very quickly on this, and I really benefited from Liz's insight on this. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that while there's obviously an effective alliance between Russia and China, China's global interests are not the same as Russia's interests, and particularly in terms of the economic footprint. In fact, China had invested a lot in Ukraine. From what I could tell, the Chinese were shocked and very deeply worried by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and didn't expect that. There was a lot of speculation of whether Putin and the Chinese leadership had coordinated, but from the little I've seen, it doesn't seem to be the case. Quite the contrary, because that kind of action is not something that China would necessarily see as useful for its own economic interest or strategic interest. And I think and the other thing is, of course, there was an understanding on the status of Taiwan. Maybe it's inevitable that it will fall apart. Maybe it's inevitable that China will go into Taiwan. But I think the events have speeded up the disintegration of that agreement, or certainly made it much more wobbly. One can debate whether, in fact, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was useful or not. But in some sense, these events seem to be converging. And there's an interesting argument among policymakers in Washington about the extent to which the U.S. might have played its cards differently. Tom Friedman, who's not a policymaker but influences the debate, sometime had a very aggressive piece in the New York Times saying Pelosi should not go, and that we should do everything we can not to turn China into the kind of enemy that we don't need. So I'm not coming down on that debate, but I think if in terms of sort of teaching about this conflict, we have to recognize and in part to our students, a sense of the complexity of these issues and the various interests, and particularly where and how the tensions between Russia and China play out, as opposed to just seeing them as obvious allies who are going to coordinate because they always have mutual interests.
Thanks for all your contributions. I think one question that I have is relates to American credibility on the world stage and whether or not, to what extent that is influential in this conflict, and whether or not that its influence would have been different had the United States not eroded a lot of its international credibility through wars in the Middle East and also in the various breaking of international agreements during the Trump administration. I did hear a perspective from one commentator that had the United States not engaged in these kinds of activities, that there would be a more effective ability to rally support, for Ukraine, whereas today then there is a more sort of diffused influence around the world, and therefore, we're now looking at multiple theaters of potential conflict and space being filled by other actors. So I guess I mean my question is whether or not you think that's a convincing argument, or whether you think that this actually has less to do with U.S. credibility on the world stage and more to do with how the international system operates today.
Liz, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. It's a great question. I think that as I said before, I think the U.S. responses to previous Russian interventionism was a factor, and there was just a great show on Frontline this week on Putin and previous presidents, and it shows how the U.S. reacted very, very ineffectually to earlier conflicts in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014, and Putin had the idea he could get away with this, and also he was overconfident and thought he could carry out his plan very quickly, which turned out to be false. So I think that's a part of it. I'll let others talk about the Middle East wars, but from my point of view, I think what we should keep in mind is that Russia and China both have effective propaganda machines that they use especially in the developing world and in areas where the U.S. has ceded the stage, like Africa. You have Russia and China being much more involved than the U.S. And even though like the anti-colonial argument should resonate in Africa, the propaganda that they're getting from China and Russia, I think, supersedes some of those arguments. But remember, one of the best pro-Ukraine speeches at the UN was by the Kenyan representative early on. And so I think there are different views in the developing world. In Asia, which I'm more familiar with, the Ukraine has some sympathy because there's a lot of concern about sovereignty in Asia. But the countries are dependent on these grain flows. And so I don't think it's U.S. credibility that is restraining these countries from more overtly supporting Ukraine. I think it's the fact that they're really being beaten by these adverse economic winds, and so they're just trying to stay afloat in that kind of situation. But I think U.S. credibility has increased actually because we've managed to keep a very strong coalition of European and like-minded allies in Asia on this topic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that NATO was in a state of crisis. And of course, that was accelerated by Trump, who basically did everything he could, it seemed, to undermine NATO. And the boomerang effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been to strengthen NATO and to create the possibility that NATO might have 2 more members. So I think in that sense, it's not working out the way that Putin probably had imagined. But I do think that both in terms of Obama's approach to Syria, when he threatened the use of weapons if the Syrians would use, the regime would use gas, and then he did not, said there was a red line and then ignored it or created an excuse. But even more so, Trump's neo-isolationist policy, which is basically we don't owe anybody nothing and we're pulling out and we're not going to be involved, really sort of signal an acceleration of declining U.S. interests, declining U.S. involvement. Many Middle East countries are formally part of a kind of a widened NATO alliance. They have a special sort of status that includes Israel and at least one Gulf country. But what does that mean when, in fact, throughout the Middle East, the U.S. position on Ukraine is not viewed very favorably? That's for sure. And so it does raise questions about the extent to which the U.S. Is able to influence the players. There was a very good piece in the New York Review of Books a couple of weeks ago that said, saying basically that Israel and Iran are determining U.S. foreign policy right now, and there's some truth to that. But I'm talking about in the Middle East here. But in terms of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Biden, I think, has done a pretty good job of handling the crisis and fixing some of the damage that had really resulted from Trump's mishandling in almost every way of U.S. foreign policy, including by the damaging decision to get out of the Iran nuclear deal, which we've paid a very high price for. Because I wonder, thinking counterfactually, had the deal been sustained and had the reformists in Iran seen the wind behind their sails, whether Iran would be behaving in the same way. I don't think it's obvious that it would be. But from Iran's perspective, they signed an agreement, the U.S. pulled out of it, and now we're getting our just desserts, and they're exercising that retribution in Ukraine. So there's a lot of, I think we've made decisions, particularly under Trump, that really have influenced the perceptions of all the players. And in the case of Syria, the sense that the U.S. is basically no longer an effective player at all, which is largely the case. Right. And once the Kurds are eliminated politically or physically or whatever, even more so. So it's but I mean, the silver lining here, if there is one, is that definitely Biden has been able to resuscitate NATO. And if you're a poll, you know what your conclusions are looking at what Russia has done. We're next or whatever. So that I understand that.
Yeah, often last year, I was wondering how this would have played out differently if it had happened under Trump. I think it would have played out really differently. Like, Trump was hostile towards NATO. He was, hostile towards Ukraine, actually. He wanted to use Ukrainian politics for his own political gains. I do not see this. And I think Putin was sort of, as Liz said, was kind of gaming on or miscalculating on a sort of more of that kind of U.S. response, kind of the we're not so concerned about the rest of the world type of response.
My question is, what happened to the European Union? Like, they are very quiet. They should take initiative in here, and they just try to wait out this conflict. They would like to do business again with Putin.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, as far as the refugees, European Union is not very much involved. When we had refugees from different areas, they were providing aid, but as far as Ukrainian, they kind of don't get involved. What happened?
Yeah, I think Europe is actually divided, and I think a lot of European countries are taking a lot of refugees. So Poland and Hungary, and I think also Germany have a lot of refugees. The UK has also been quite in favor of helping Ukraine, and I think I was at a conference in Finland in the fall, and they were mostly European participants, and they were all disagreeing with each other, right? So I think Germany's position has always been, or since the 70s, quite pro-Russian, right? Like they and more pro-Russian than Americans would like, right? They have Germany has gained from trading with the Soviet Union and then Russia, and then there's obviously the energy link, right? But then other countries in the European Union are more worried about Russia, right? And Poland, the Eastern European members are actually leading the sort of charge on this, right? So Germany, this is a case of the tanks, right? It took Germany forever to agree on exporting the tanks, but the Poles and the Hungarians and the Slovaks had already, agreed to exporting the tanks. They were just waiting for the German approval. So I guess Europe is not a unitary actor, but as a whole, the European Union as a governing body has been quite supportive of Ukraine, I think. And the energy question looms large, but I think it's also about, as you said, refugees and weapons. And they have sort of, been sometimes quite slow, but they have maintained unity with the US sort of in the end, as the sort of EU as a body, even though some member countries are even slower and so on.
Depending which European country you are, you're paying a very different price for their energy situation. So the differences in terms of the energy equation, I think, are very important. It's easy to be critical of Germany or whatever, but you got a cold winter on your hands or whatever. So it is a tough situation. But EU is a trading organization, right? It's not basically a military organization, so it's not going to have a decisive influence in that regard.
But they did impose sanctions, I would say, pretty strong sanctions, and they agreed to a cap on oil prices. So
Right, that's true. Right.
Yeah.
They've managed to deal with a very complex situation. And of course, the long-term impact is going to be that the European countries will find a way around dependence on Russian gas. And, that's a positive outcome. So the question is how to get through this.
So it seems that the input from this panel has added several layers more of complexity in looking at the Russian war on Ukraine, whether it's geopolitical or economic or a combination of the two. And that's fascinating, but also makes it intimidating to think about conveying that level of complexity in a high school classroom. And so I was wondering, as kind of a takeaway, I kind of have a two-part question. One for our subject area expert presenters, if there's sort of a broader generalist level version of what you're trying to convey that we can take, in addition to our pages of notes, like some kind of, if you're trying to explain what you just said to your own high school kid and their friends, how do you convey that? And then to the educators in the class, in the session, to me, it seems like this, I'm not an educator yet myself, I'm just learning, but it seems that it would lend itself to like a role play kind of thing, like maybe not even as complicated as a Model UN, maybe more like a board game or something where you're in Indonesia and you have to acquire this much credits of grain or whatever. Is this something that any of you have done with like a contemporary issue? Are there organizations that do this? Basically, how would you approach something this complex and bringing it down to a high school level?
So I'll take that question, and I actually have to run out in a few minutes to teach my class. So I apologize if I don't actually provide a sufficient answer, and I won't be able to stick around. So please feel free to email me. I'm at Notre Dame. My email is on the website, or Esther or Krishna can pass it on. So a big sort of very general thing that I sometimes teach my student is we're very used to thinking about countries as colored blobs on the map, right? Look at the map, this is one colored blob and this is another colored blob. But in terms of what the things that I study, it's actually flows of things that connect the blobs, right? So there's, grain and energy and human, refugees and workers and often the sort of actual lives of people are more influenced by these flows than by the color of your blob. Sure, you're Ukrainian, right? And there's like that national identity and Russian identity. But where Ukraine's going to come from, if your house is heated or not, depends on the flows, right? And on your dependency on who's supplying whatever is flowing, right? So I guess in terms of maybe your own thinking or class prepping, like, it doesn't actually, it's not that hard to figure out the flows if you think about the flows, but sometimes we don't think about the flows because we're sort of stuck in the colored blob world. I will take off, but thanks so much again, and good luck with that complexity. We're all wrestling.
Right. Nice to meet you. I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
I don't, that's a great question. I started out with that issue in my presentation because I do think it's important to sensitize students to some sense of trying to, what are our basic frameworks for making sense of any politics? And that's not an easy thing to teach, but I think it's somehow important to get them sensitive to it because what we interpret as the facts are not obvious. And I think some ability to be sort of critical thinkers in that regard is important. But I think that what they need to know is what are the particular, from the perspective of the governments of these countries, what are their particular interests, strategic, economic in particular, security, and how the sort of status of those interests before the conflict created a certain sort of set of understandings, which you can list pretty clearly, and then sort of go through an analysis of how those understandings, those accommodations were sort of literally and figuratively blown up. Maybe that's too ambitious, but I think that's doable. But I think your point about, essentially some sort of game in which you're sort of each person is asked to play the role of a particular country and to get an assignment to assess their interests and then sort of play it out to see what would have been their best move or not their best move. Something like that would be very useful. But it's hard to teach because it is, even for us sitting here in this room, I mean, it took me weeks and months to go through notes and try to figure some of this out for myself. So I think it's, I think it's doable, but we really have to sort of do literally our homework before we step into this with our students.
I agree. This is a very complex case. In terms of my region, what I was trying to show is that Russia's war in Ukraine provides some opportunities for some countries like China and India in terms of cheaper access to energy, but there are a lot of costs for other countries in terms of economic costs because of rising food prices, less access to food, and because other countries are watching this war and learning lessons, like North Korea is learning that nuclear threats might help them, and so on. But there is one resource I would direct you to. Can I share my screen? Is that possible, Eugene?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen then. Let's see if I can find. It's not. Where is it? It's okay. So this is from the council. I think I'm do you hear me or am I frozen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. My photo is frozen, but this is from the Council on Foreign Relations. It's CFR.org, and they have these simulation case studies that are free, and they have these what they call pop-up cases on current events, and so they have a whole series on Ukraine. And so I've used these. I taught at the college level, but I'm sure you could adapt this kind of material for a high school classroom pretty easily. But what's handy about them is that they give you the facts, they give you a sense of roles, and I mean they have quizzes and things on the site which I never used, but it's a useful way to start off if you're looking for a way to create a simulation. So I always love doing simulations in the classroom, and I think this would be great because countries do have different interests, and when you put students in the roles of different countries, they can really see that more clearly.
I want to add that a few years ago at a similar event like this, I think also it was in the fall, we had a representative from CFR actually talk about, obviously it wasn't about the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but so I know there's links to that on our educator outreach page. So that'll help you. So if you're trying to, we'll get this link and send it and get it up on the resources page for this event. But if you're curious, if you look at past events on the educator outreach page, you'll also see links to different of these simulations from, I don't know, it was before COVID, so I don't remember the year.
Who remembers any?
Yeah. So, but thank you for recalling that resource, because I was like, oh, I wonder if CFR has done anything on this particular conflict.
Yeah, and they also have a whole section of their think tank that deals with education. And as an educator, you can sign up for free and you can listen to weekly talks by experts. You can have your class attend some of these talks. And they're policy talks, so they're not heavy on theory. And I think for upper level high school students, it could be interesting and useful.
Another interesting perspective is the psychology of leaders. I mean, you can gain a lot just reading speeches by Putin and get a sense of sort of where he's coming from and what his greatest fears are, in the sense of his ability to express collective Russian humiliation for the end of the Cold War, which he described as the biggest geostrategic, calamity in the world or whatever. And without trying to make excuse for or rationalize his actions, I think in having some sort of understanding of what's making people like Putin tick and how that evolves over time is useful. Biographies can be helpful, but they can just you can just read the speeches, read Bibi Netanyahu's speeches. What makes him tick? What makes the Iranian leaders? I mean, there's a lot out there that's translated that could provide a helpful perspective on sort of how they view the world, and might explain some of their actions, or at least have a sense of what the possible explanations are.
Well, I think we are just about at time. So I just want to thank our panelists once again. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Absentia. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Eugene. So we have come to the end of our program today. And I want to thank you all so much for participating and being here on this very chilly day.
Cool.
We really appreciate you making the effort to come out here and participate in an in-person professional development program. We really, really want to thank you for that. Just to close, as Esther mentioned, we will have all the resources that were mentioned during this series of presentations available on our UChicago Educator Outreach webpage after the event. Usually it takes us a couple weeks to get all that stuff organized, but we will send a follow-up email to everyone who attended with the recordings and with the resource links and et cetera.